Have you ever watched someone build a perfect life on top of someone else's pain? Have you ever wondered how a man who smiled at charity galas on Saturday could come home and use his fists on Sunday? Have you ever asked yourself why the women who suffer the most are so often the last ones anyone believes? This is the story of Nadia. No, wait. This is not that kind of story. There is no single moment where everything makes sense. There is no neat before and after. There is only what happened, and what it cost, and what was left when the cost was finally paid. Her name was Alara Voss, and she was 31 years old when she poured her husband's morning coffee for the last time. She had done it the same way for 6 years. 2 sugars, a splash of 2% milk, the ceramic mug he'd bought himself in Whistler the winter, before they got engaged. The one with the small chip on the handle that he'd never let her throw out. She set it on the kitchen island at precisely 7:15 every morning, exactly where he wanted it, exactly as he wanted it. And she stood back and waited for him to decide whether the morning was going to be a good one or a bad one. That was how she had learned to measure her days, not by weather, not by her own moods or her own plans or the things she'd once wanted to do with her life. She measured them by the look on his face when he picked up that mug. His name was Garrison. No, that name's taken. His name was Theodore. Not Theodore. He corrected people once, and then he never corrected them again. He just stopped speaking to them. Theodore Crane was, by every external measure, the kind of man other men envied and women were told to want. He ran a mid-sized commercial real estate firm out of downtown Calgary. He sat on the board of 2 non-profits. He had thick dark hair that grayed at the temples in the way that magazine spreads call distinguished. And he knew exactly how to walk into a room so that people looked at him first. Alara had fallen for all of it. She was 24, fresh out of a landscape architecture program at the University of Guelph, new to the city, and Theodore had seemed like someone who already knew where he was going. She had thought that meant she could stop figuring it out alone. She understood, much later, that this was what he looked for. Someone still building themselves. Someone whose edges hadn't hardened yet. The first time he hit her, they had been married for 14 months. She had made plans with a friend. A woman named Dory she'd met through a running group, someone easy and funny who liked bad reality television and good hiking trails. She had told Theodore about it at dinner 3 nights before. He'd said nothing. On the day itself, she had reminded him over breakfast and he'd smiled and said have fun. And then at 6 o'clock, when she was already in her coat and reaching for her keys, he appeared in the hallway and asked her, very quietly, where she thought she was going. She said she was meeting Dory. He said she hadn't asked him. She said she had told him. The distinction, he explained, was the point. She didn't go to meet Dory. She stood in the front hallway of their house in Altadore with a bruise forming along her left cheekbone, and she tried to remember whether she had, in fact, asked. She went through the memory the way you press a wound, carefully, to find where it hurts most. She was still not sure, that first night, that it hadn't been her fault. That is the thing people outside of it never understand. The confusion is not stupidity. It is something he built, deliberately, over the months before the first time he raised his hand. By then, Alara had already stopped trusting her own version of events. He had made sure of it. She had a sister. Her name was Waverly. No, that's in the list. Her name was Rosalind. 3 years older, a family lawyer based in Edmonton. The kind of woman who read contracts for pleasure and kept a color-coded calendar 18 months out. Alara and Rosalind had never been the type of sisters who told each other everything. Their mother had raised them to be capable, which sometimes meant they forgot to be vulnerable with each other. But they spoke every Sunday. That was the rule they'd kept since their father died. After the first incident, Alara almost said something. They were on the phone, a Tuesday call because Rosalind had been in court on the Sunday, and Rosalind asked how things were going, and Alara said fine. Things were fine. Calgary was cold. Theodore was busy with a new development on the east side. She did not say, he hit me last week and I haven't been able to sleep on my left side since. Instead she filed it away. She told herself it was a single incident. She told herself he had apologized. He had, at length, in a way that frightened her a little with its precision, the way an apology can feel like another form of control. She told herself this was not who Theodore was. He showed her, over the following years, exactly who he was. It was not always the same. Sometimes it was a hand around her wrist, tight enough to leave a bracelet of yellow bruising. Sometimes it was something thrown. A glass, a book, once the ceramic mug from Whistler, that he then picked up and placed back on the counter as though nothing had happened. Sometimes it was the kind of harm that doesn't leave a mark you can photograph. The voice, the words, chosen to locate the exact place where she felt smallest. The way he could take something she loved and make her ashamed of it. She had given up running, her friendship with Dory, her small practice of painting watercolors on Sunday afternoons. Not because he forbade these things explicitly. Because he had a way of responding to them that made her feel foolish for wanting them. She stopped telling Rosalind about her weeks. There was nothing safe left to say. The second thing people outside don't understand is that leaving is not a decision you make once. Alara made it 17 times in 6 years. She packed a bag in the bathroom on a Tuesday morning while he was in the shower. She stood in a Shoppers Drug Mart parking lot in February at 11 p.m., with her keys in her hand and her phone in the other, and she scrolled to Rosalind's name and did not press call. She drove to a hotel on McLeod Trail once and sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes, and drove home again, because she had left her laptop inside, and she had a client presentation in the morning, and she could not afford to make her professional life smaller than it had already become. Every time she went back, something inside her recalculated. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment. She told herself she needed more. Enough to make sure he couldn't talk his way out of it. Enough so that when she finally left, she left in a way that was permanent, in a way that protected her. Rosalind found out on a Thursday afternoon in November. She had driven down from Edmonton unannounced. Something she almost never did. Because she'd been passing through for a settlement meeting that ran short and she thought she'd surprise Alara for dinner. Theodore was still at his office. Alara answered the door in a long-sleeved shirt in a house that was 68 degrees, and Rosalind looked at her the way lawyers look at things they are about to take apart. She said, "Take off your cardigan." Alara said, "Rose," she said, "take it off." The bruising on Alara's upper arms was in its 3rd day, which meant it had moved from red into the purple-green that photographs well. Rosalind stood in the front hallway of that house in Altadore, the same hallway, the same spot, and she looked at her younger sister and her face went somewhere very still and very cold. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She said, "How long?" Alara said 6 years. The silence lasted a long time. Then Rosalind sat down on the bottom stair and put her hands on her knees and said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." What they did took time. Rosalind was a family lawyer. She knew what conviction required. She knew that bruising photographs and disappears, that a single incident is harder to prosecute than a pattern, that Theodore Crane was exactly the kind of man who would hire exactly the kind of lawyer who would take a jury apart piece by piece if the case was not airtight. She also knew that Alara would not be safe during any period in which Theodore suspected what was coming. So they built something. Alara bought a small digital camera and kept it in the inner pocket of her winter coat. She documented dates, times, injuries. She kept a journal on a Google account Theodore didn't know about, accessed only from her work computer. She made note of witnesses without approaching them. A neighbor who had heard shouting through a shared fence. A colleague of Theodore's who had seen Alara flinch at a company dinner, and who had looked away the way people look away when they know and cannot afford to know. She was meticulous. She was terrified every day. Theodore for his part became harder to predict. He had a business partner named Fenwick. An older man, quiet, who had built the firm with Theodore in the early years and who had started, very gradually, to look at Theodore differently in meetings. Alara didn't know what Fenwick had noticed. She didn't ask. She kept her head down and kept her camera and kept her journal. And on Sunday nights, when Theodore was watching something in the study, she called Rosalind and gave her updates in a low voice from the back corner of the walk-in closet. She was 30 years old. She had been inside this for 6 years. She had a plan. What she did not have, what she had not let herself account for, was how much of herself she was using just to stay standing. There is a kind of survival that hollows you out. You pour everything into endurance, into strategy, into the daily performance of a wife who is not documenting her husband, and at some point there is nothing left over. No hunger, no sleep, no sense of a future that exists in her own name. She started losing weight she didn't have to lose. She stopped eating full meals, told herself she wasn't hungry, which was true, but not for the reason she pretended. Her friend Dory, she'd quietly reconnected with her, careful, infrequent, texts only, noticed and asked once if she was okay, and Alara said she was just stressed with work. She was 31 years old and she was disappearing in slow motion. It was February when she found the emails. Theodore had left his laptop open on the kitchen table. He almost never did this. He was careful with his devices in a way that had always seemed like privacy but was, she understood now, closer to concealment. But he'd taken a call and walked into the backyard and left the screen unlocked. She looked. She was not proud of it. She was not proud of very many things she'd done in 6 years. And she had made peace with a version of herself that operated outside the rules of the marriage she'd thought she was in. She looked. The emails were to a woman named Cressida. She worked at the commercial development firm Theodore partnered with on the East Side project. The emails went back 11 months. They were explicit and they were affectionate in a way he had not been with Alara in years, and they described, in one of them, a weekend in Banff that Alara remembered as a solo business trip. She took photographs of the screen. She sent them to Rosalind. Then she closed the laptop and put it back exactly as she'd found it, and she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at Theodore pacing the yard with his phone pressed to his ear, gesturing at something invisible, and she felt not devastated. She was past devastated. She felt for the first time in a very long time something almost like clarity. They moved in March. Not Alara, not yet. The evidence did. Rosalind had spent 3 months working with a colleague in Calgary, a criminal lawyer named Adebayo, someone she trusted absolutely, building the formal documentation into something a Crown prosecutor could use. The photographs, the journal, which Alara had printed and had notarized, 2 signed statements from people who had witnessed incidents, the neighbor, whose name was Patrick, and a former assistant of Theodore's, a young woman who had left the company 18 months ago, and who, when Rosalind reached out carefully and professionally, had things to say that she had been waiting for an opportunity to say. Adebayo filed. The morning the RCMP arrived at Theodore Crane's office, he was in a meeting with Fenwick and 2 representatives from a Vancouver development group. His assistant came in and said there were officers at reception, and Theodore stood up and said there must be some mistake and walked out and never came back in. Alara was not there. She was at Rosalind's house in Edmonton, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she kept forgetting to drink, watching her phone. When Rosalind called and said it's done, she put the phone down and sat very still for a long time. She was not happy, she was not relieved, exactly. She was something underneath those things, something that didn't have a clean name. Theodore Crane was charged with assault causing bodily harm, criminal harassment, and breach of trust under the criminal code. He hired the lawyer Rosalind had predicted he would hire, a man named Brandt who was expensive and sharp, and who had an instinct for finding contradictions. Brandt found several. The case took 14 months. He was convicted on the first 2 counts. He was sentenced to 4 years. His business partnership with Fenwick dissolved before the verdict. The East Side Development Project was acquired by a competing firm. Cressida, for what it's worth, had stopped returning his calls before the arrest. Alara sat in the courtroom for the verdict. She had not planned to, but Rosalind said she didn't have to plan anything. She just had to decide that morning, and that morning she decided. She wore a dark green coat she'd bought for herself in January, the first item of clothing she'd purchased. Without thinking about what Theodore would think of it, she sat in the gallery beside Rosalind and Dory, who had driven 4 hours from Lethbridge without being asked, who had shown up on the Edmonton doorstep 2 weeks earlier, with a bag of groceries, and absolutely no interest in talking about it, which was exactly what Alara had needed. When the verdict was read, she didn't feel the swell of justice that movies prepare you for. She felt tired. She felt the specific, dense exhaustion of someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has just been told she can set it down. She felt, underneath that, something tentative and unfamiliar. Something she would later identify as the earliest, most fragile version of wanting things for herself again. She moved back to Calgary the following spring, to a rental apartment near the Elbow River, with a south-facing balcony and a gas fireplace she turned on every morning, even when it wasn't cold. She went back to landscape architecture. She started running again, slowly, rebuilding the distance the way she rebuilt most things in that period. Carefully, without forcing it, without being too hard on herself when a week went sideways. Dory visited in June. They went hiking in Kananaskis on a day when the light hit the peaks in a way that is particular to Alberta in early summer. That specific gold that exists nowhere else. They didn't talk about Theodore. They talked about Dory's new dog, a chaotic black lab named Biscuit, and about a podcast they were both behind on, and about the particular cruelty of trekking poles when you're out of practice. On the drive home, Dory said, "Are you okay? Actually okay?" Alara thought about it. She said, "I'm getting there." And that was true. Not a consolation, not a performance. She was getting there, imperfectly and unevenly and sometimes very slowly, in the way that healing actually works. Not in a straight line, not on a schedule, not with a clean moment at the end where everything before it is resolved. She was getting there. She painted a watercolor that August. A small one, just the view from her balcony, the river bend, the cottonwoods going yellow at the edges. She framed it and put it above the fireplace. Nobody told her whether it was good. Nobody looked at it and decided what it meant about her. It was hers, and she put it where she wanted it, and that was enough. The foundation came the year after. Rosalind had been pushing for something like it for a while, some formal way to channel what had happened, some use for the story beyond what it had cost. Alara resisted it at first. She didn't want to become the thing that had happened to her. She had spent 6 years being defined by someone else's choices. She wasn't interested in spending the next 6 being defined by her survival of them. But Adebayo connected her with an organization in Calgary that provided legal aid and emergency support for women navigating domestic violence cases in the justice system. And after she spent a morning volunteering there, she understood something differently. It wasn't about becoming the story. It was about making the story useful, handing something forward, giving the women sitting in the places she had once sat something she had not had enough of. Someone who knew exactly what the system required and how to help them build it. She got involved. She stayed involved. She is still involved. Her name is Alara Voss. She is 34 years old. She lives near the Elbow River in Calgary, in a south-facing apartment with a watercolor above the fireplace. She runs 3 times a week. She has a standing Sunday call with her sister. She buys her own coffee mugs. If you are in something right now that looks like a marriage but feels like a trap, she would want you to know this. The plan you are waiting for the right moment to make? You can start it now. You don't have to wait until you have everything. You start with one thing, one person you trust, one document, one date and time written down somewhere safe. You start small. You let the plan grow. And if you do not know where to start, start by calling someone. You do not have to figure this out alone.